The Awareness Revolution Podcast, where we bring you alternative views on big topics that affect just about everyone. If you want to improve your life and change the world, then stay tuned. You'll hear cutting-edge health, financial, and personal development strategies from a revolutionary perspective. Warning: listening may take you outside your comfort zone, separate you from the pack, and change the way you see the world. Here's your host, Jeremy Kinney.
I'm going to tell you the truth about white guilt. Whether you're black or white, you should really listen to this entire podcast. It's going to be packed full of information, and likely it's going to be packed full of information that you aren't aware of yet. So for the white people, this is going to be your antidote for white guilt. Because the truth is there's no reason why you should have any. That's the truth about white guilt. There's no reason to have white guilt. I'm going to get more into that in just a second, but let me address the black people first. Obviously, I want to start off, there's not a racist bone in my body, okay? I'm going to get into my story here in just a moment as well, and you'll see, I think, from my story, if nothing else, I've been more on black people's side with everything, okay? So I think for black people this is also important to know, because the version of history, particularly regarding this topic, the version of slavery that we were taught in schools, is really a good example of education malpractice. We're taught a very distorted version of history, especially with slavery, and it's going to help black people learn more about their culture, their history, their past, their ancestors, and that's great. It's great for them too, but also it's going to help take away some of this awkwardness and maybe hopefully some of this hatred towards white people, because it's empowering for black people, and it should feel a lot better knowing that, the evil white man isn't out there to get you. Now, I know this is controversial, so, please excuse me, let's not get our emotions involved and just try to stick to the facts here and allow me to present this case, and just know that I'm making a courageous, bold move by discussing a controversial topic like this as a white male. And right now the white male has never been under so much pressure and being scrutinized, and basically it's terrible what's going on right now. We're being framed as the bad people, which is really sexist and racist when you look at it. But ultimately, this is great news for everybody, so let's go ahead and get started. Before I get into all the facts, I just want to give you a little bit about myself and my background. I'll try to go through it quick, because I want to get to the facts, because that's the important part, all right? I grew up, when I was a young kid, I grew up in the projects, like my earliest memories. Maybe I have some other memories, like that are vague memories, but, from the beginning of my life, when I can actually remember living, regularly in details and stuff like that, I was about in kindergarten, and we literally lived in the projects. I had a single mom. My real dad was murdered before I was even born. My mom was holding his hand when he flatlined in a coma. So I had a rough upbringing from the time I was in the womb. But I can only account for kindergarten up, but starting from kindergarten, I was one of the only kids in this project, and was mostly black. The kids would pick on me. They would terrorize us when they had like a little playground area that everyone in the projects played at, and it was right outside of my back door, and they would terrorize me and my brother. I didn't know why. I didn't think that they were being racist to me because of my color at the time, and I certainly didn't have any white privilege there, so I understand what it's like being poor, being in the projects, and being amongst the black community. And that wasn't the only time. I mean, we moved from there to other places where I went to black schools all the way up until second grade. And the kids picked on me at school too. You know, they used to punch me. I mean, I remember one time I got kicked in the face, and there were so many kids around. Like, they would just do it so often. I mean, I just literally just got kicked and didn't know why. I just kept on moving on with my day, you know, at recess. So, you know, I mean, I experienced a lot of things like that. I mean, my best friend at the time stole from me, you know, stole a whole bunch of Nintendo games. Back then, we were poor, you know, these were gold back then. And it never turned me racist. You know, I never looked at it as a race thing. But I do come from that. I grew up listening to rap music. You know, if anything else, you know, when I moved out of there because it was so rough as a kid, I moved to the suburbs where it was mostly white. You know, if anything else, my parents, adults, and stuff like that, I was more criticized for being more black. You know, like liking rap music as a really young kid. It was very controversial then. And but the thing is when I moved to the white schools, it was the other way around. There were only a few black kids in the school, and the white kids did not pick on the black kids like the school I just came from, where the black kids picked on the white kids. It was exact same. Only one or two white kids in a black school. Moved to white schools, only one or two black kids in our grade. So I did notice a big difference in that. And it wasn't until later on I was able to look back in retrospect and really analyze the situation and see what was really going on here. But again, I never carried that with me. I was never like, oh, the black kids used to, you know, this and that. I still listen to rap music. Typically, the black kids in our school was the people that I hung out with. We played basketball, we rapped and stuff like that. You know what I mean? So I was always that kid, right? But I thought racism was a thing in the past. It was getting better and better, especially like once, you know, it got to the point to where, you know, my mom started listening to rap music instead of forbidding me to listen to it. So, you know, everything was going good until Obama got in there and started bringing up race with all these things. But that's another topic. So I just want to say, still to this day, I bought my first house in a black neighborhood. I still own it. It's been almost 15 years now that I've owned this house. I've rented out for 11 of the years. So I still own multiple properties in a predominantly black neighborhood. And they look at me, they're racist towards me. Like, oh, you know, I've gotten it from them, you know, like, oh, this white cracker, you know, owning real estate. And I bought it as working at Chili's as a restaurant cook, $10.50 an hour. Hard work, saved up the money. When everybody else that I knew, my friends and stuff like that, was just blowing their money. So I bought it from hard work sacrifice, not because I'm white privileged. You know, when I worked at the Chili's, the black cooks that would work in there longer than me, they made more money than me. So I certainly didn't have a privilege at the job either. The lender didn't loan me the money over the black kids because I'm white. I saved up the money. I made sure I had a good credit score, and I bought it. All right. So that's enough of my story. Let's go ahead and dig into some of the history of slavery so we get a more accurate picture of what happened in our past. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, about 12.5 million slaves came to the New World, and that's North America, South America, and the Caribbean. Only 10.7 million of them actually made it here, and of those, about 388,000 people came to North America. So that's about 4% of the entire transatlantic slave trade made it to North America. That's not the United States. That's to the entire continent. 4%. That means that 96% of the slaves went elsewhere. A lot of them went to the Caribbean and Brazil. So I wonder if in the Caribbean or Brazil, if they get as much hatred or whatever you want to call it for the slave trade, because they were way more involved in it than people were in the United States of America. I know from my perspective, living in the U.S., that people here don't blame the Brazilians. They don't blame the Caribbean. They don't blame other countries. The way that we're taught here is basically like they all came here. You know, like we went over there, started gathering up black people because of the color of their skin, and started bringing them over here, and that's basically the story. But of course, there's a lot more to the story. And if you're not telling the whole story, then that's a way you can lie. You know, you can actually lie by only tell part of the story because it distorts the message. And I believe that's what's happened with our educational system. I can't prove this, but I think it's to create a divide and conquer method. You know, because the government is small in numbers compared to the population, and the more that we are together as a people, as a population, the more we can team up and overthrow the government or challenge the government or basically just check the government, right? But as long as they can always keep us fighting amongst each other, then they can always, there's basically a needed job position to be a referee. That's kind of what the government is a referee, to make sure no one, you know, infringes on the rights of the other person, right? So they want us arguing over each other. They want us being poor so that way they have work to do, all right? I know this is all crazy, and it sounds crazy at least, and I'm digressing from the topic a little bit, but we have to uncover some sort of a motive of why they would leave out this history. Now, if you have another theory of why this is left out of history in our schools, let me know. You know, feel free to write me, info@theawarenessrevolution.com. If you're watching this on my YouTube channel, because I do have a YouTube channel just for the podcast, so if you're listening to this in audio on iTunes or somewhere, I also have a video podcast on iTunes. I also have a video podcast on YouTube, the Awareness Revolution podcast. You can just search for that. But the best place to go for any of my podcast episodes, you can just find the show notes at theawarenessrevolution.com/13. That's just the number 13 for 13, because this is the 13th podcast episode. You have the show notes where I give you some links and more information, and I'm going to break down this whole thing there as well. So, back to our story. Only about 6% of white Americans in the South actually owned slaves at the height of slavery. So if you include the people in the North, that brings the number down to 1.4% of Americans owning slaves. That's literally the 1%. You know, that's a very small portion of the population. Now, of course, you should only feel guilty for something that you did, right? You don't feel guilty for things that other people did. You know, it's not your fault, especially not people that lived before you, right? It doesn't make sense for me if something happens, you know, my neighbor or someone the next state over or whatever, they do something, I don't feel guilty for it like I did it. I don't owe anyone anything because some random person did something to some random person. And that's today. So it's much more far-fetched to convince me to feel guilty for something that happened before I was even born, right? And especially when, you know, so they want all white people to feel guilty for what happened with slavery, even though it was just a small portion of people that did it. And at the time, it was considered okay, right? So morality kind of changes. It's subjective to a pretty good extent because things change over time. And I certainly don't, obviously, you know, it's a shame that it happened, but it didn't just happen here. It wasn't just the transatlantic slave trade. Slavery happened all throughout the world, of all people of all different cultures. And this is all happening throughout history all over the world. So really the transatlantic slave trade is just a small portion of the history of slavery. Black people owned slaves. Black people sold us, the slaves, to come over here. And even black people over here in the United States owned slaves as well. Yes, there were black people that were free, and some of them owned slaves. So this wasn't about racism. It was really a class thing more than the color of their skin. Because if it was merely just, or solely just the color of their skin, all blacks would have been slaves. And there would have been no black slave owners. On top of that, there were actually white people that were slaves. Some of the Irish came here and they were slaves. And interestingly, white slaves were worth less than black slaves. Black slaves were more expensive. That's why actually most of the slaves went to South America, because of the route. It was easier to get them there. So therefore, the slaves that went to South America were cheaper. So they were valued less than the slaves that came up here. Because the black slaves that went to North America, they were more expensive and therefore more valued. So they were considered more valuable than the black slaves in South America, and they were even considered more valuable than the white slaves. Okay? And that's where we get this term redneck from. Redneck is from white slaves getting burns on their necks. You know? So there's a lot that we need to be aware of if we're going to have an accurate viewpoint. You know? Everyone passionately has their views, but they don't have all the information. That's what this is all about. I'm not casting judgment. I'm not saying slavery is okay. I'm not saying I don't have sympathy for the ancestors, slavery and everything like that. But the truth is no one alive today was a slave owner, and no one was a slave. So I shouldn't be feeling guilty for stuff I didn't do. Also, you know, like when it comes to, like, some people are advocating for reparations, that doesn't make any sense, because you would be having people that were never slave owners paying people who were never slaves. And not all black people came here with slavery in their past. You know, free black people came here after slavery was abolished. And maybe some black people, they think that their ancestors were slaves, but in fact their ancestors were slave owners. So should some of the black people who had ancestors that were slave owners, should they feel guilt too? Should they pay the reparations? You know, it's a lot more murky than the way it's presented in most cases. I mean, a lot of white people came here after slavery was abolished. So should they feel guilty? You know, their ancestors were never slave owners. There's so many things wrong with the version of slavery that we're taught. So that's why white guilt just needs to go away. We need to just get rid of the term, and we should not try to convince people to feel guilty over something that, one, most people know very little about, and were basically lied to by omitting most of the story. And two, you know, it's over. Nothing. We can't do anything to change it, but learn from it. And if we want everyone to be treated equally, then we have to treat everyone equally. Does that make sense? Again, I'm not condoning slavery. I hate that I have to say that. But let's just point out some more things here. At least half of the whites that came here and that first colonized were slaves. And, you know, however you want to look at it, a lot of the whites that came here were indentured servants. So, technically not a slave. But, you know, people kind of almost act like whites came here on a giant, luxurious cruise ship, drinking wine with slaves. It was rough to get here, even for white people, and many white people also had rough things. Maybe they had to throw their babies overboard. A lot of them didn't make it, and they risked their life and lost their life over getting here. And when they got here, if they were lucky enough to make it here, they were indentured servants. But the price that they paid to get here paid off for their following generations, which is you and I. And we should be grateful for that. And though it's unfortunate that they had to go through that, though it's unfortunate that black people, a lot of them, actually had to go through even worse to get here, but they should also, instead of hating that history, they should appreciate what their ancestors did for them, because now blacks in America make 20 to 50 times as much money as blacks around the world. So really it paid off for their lineage as well. Another thing to think about is the Civil War. A lot of people believe the Civil War was fought over slavery, which isn't the full truth. I won't get into that, but let's just say it is true. That means that there were white people in the North willing to go to war with other white people to abolish slavery. And if you look at it, white people pretty much ended slavery. If you look at the people over in Europe, like William Wilberforce, there were a lot of white people that were advocating for the abolishment of slavery before it happened. And then once it happened over there, it happened over here in the U.S. And then it took a lot longer for other countries like Brazil and places in the Caribbean to abolish slavery. So really, white people owned a small amount of slaves in the U.S. for a small window of time throughout world history and ended up abolishing slavery, but yet we're the ones that are blamed for slavery. As the leading African American historian, John Hope Franklin, points out, that 3,000 free black men owned slaves in New Orleans in 1860. That was 28% of the free black population. So in New Orleans, 28% of the free black men owned slaves, while only 1.4% of white men owned slaves. And even worse, the black men owned more slaves on average than their white slave owner counterparts. Were they also racist, or is there more to the story? All right, now that I've covered a lot of information on slavery, hopefully we can all agree that there's no reason for every single white person to feel white guilt over what happened in our past regarding slavery. So let's move on to racism, because slavery isn't the only reason that a white person should feel guilt for what happened to black people, because even after slavery was abolished, blacks were still mistreated on a large scale, really. It really ended in 1860, but not really. They started incarcerating blacks for basically anything that they wanted. So it was kind of like a loophole. And there was, obviously we had segregation, and we had a lot of racial tension in the country that led all the way up until really recently, and is actually reignited very recently. And I would love to squash that as well. So we're going to go ahead and address some of that right now. So yes, I agree. Blacks have been treated unfairly. But the truth is white people are treated unfairly too. Our government is corrupt. Today, we're all being oppressed. We're all slaves. All right? So it's kind of like us all being enslaved, being in a jail cell, and then arguing about how our ancestors, the black people arguing, well, my ancestors were enslaved worse than you and your ancestors. And it's like, well, none of that really matters nearly as much as the fact that we're all enslaved right now. Now, what do we do about it? We must join hands together and fight the system. And that's a lot of what the awareness revolution is about, but we have to become aware of a lot of things that were kept from us before we have the knowledge to motivate us. The why is more important than the how. You've got to have the why. We've got to know why we should be teaming up together against the government, not teaming up with the government to go against a different subset group of Americans. So one of the things I often hear is that blacks are disproportionately mistreated by, let's say, police officers. So I get that a lot, police brutality. And that's kind of what reignited the thing with Obama and the Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, this police brutality. And, you know, I'll give you that. You know, I do agree blacks suffer from police brutality. I'll even say that blacks suffer from police brutality more than whites, because statistics show, you know, you're more likely to be shot if you're a black man than a white man, you know, if you even out the numbers. I'm going to explain why that isn't fully accurate here in just a second. But first, I do want to admit that, yes, it is happening, but it's also happening to white people too. I myself have personal experience in this department as well. I am a victim of police brutality on more than one occasion. On one occasion, they broke into my house, forced themselves into my house, beat me up, handcuffed me, and continue to beat me after they handcuffed me. I end up representing myself. I got the case dropped, and I ended up suing them because I had to get the case dropped in order to sue them, and sued the Miami police. Didn't get much money, only got $5,000. It cost me a bail to get. My friends paid $1,000 to get me out of bail the next day, to bail me out. And so, you know, it didn't make a lot of money, but it was rewarding suing them. They lied on the stand. They said that they were at the wrong house. So, you know, and that's only one example. I've passionately opposed police officers for the war on drugs and everything. That's kind of a lot what woke me up in my teenage years, was the war on drugs. I was getting in trouble a lot. I wasn't bothering anyone. I was peacefully just doing my thing. I was getting pulled over, harassed, searched, and that happened all the way up until recently, really. I've been suffering from this my entire life, to the point to where, I mean, put it this way. When I turned 14, I started saving. I got a job as soon as I turned 14 because I had a plan to save all my paychecks up for 2 years and then buy the best car I could get when I turned 16. That's exactly what I did. And I did sell one, cash one paycheck to buy a set of speakers because I love music. But anyway, I turned 16. I bought my car. I kept it just perfectly clean. I loved it. I lived in it. I went everywhere in it. It was everything to me at the time. I had so many bad experiences, cops pulling me out of cars, arresting me, that I now have PTSD. I don't like driving. I don't like being in cars. I freak out sometimes, even when I'm doing nothing wrong. Broad daylight. It's really, really bad. All right? And this has been going on since I was a teenager, you know? And then I was in my late 20s when they came into my house and assaulted me. So trust me, the police are a problem. I'm fully on board with that. But they're not just a problem for black people. They're also a problem for white people. And people need to realize that. The police are out of control. They profile people, which basically means that they're going to look at you, they're going to judge you. That's what they do. They're walking around assuming everyone is a criminal, and then they have a confirmation bias as well, because that's what they're looking for. When you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So, you know, I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying it's cool. Definitely not. Matter of fact, you know, it's hard to dislike the police more than I do. But does that mean that there's an extreme case of disproportionate brutality towards blacks versus whites? Absolutely not. So let me give you some of the more information about me, and then this is all going to make sense, so stick with me. When they were pulling me over, when I was young, I had a car with tinted windows, rims on it, subwoofers in the back. I'm driving around banging rap music really as loud as I could, you know, so it's like making all this noise. You know, if a cop's in a parking lot or in the next lane over or behind me or whatever, you know, he could hear it. And they never pulled me over. I rolled down my tinted windows and they saw my white skin. They were never like, oh, You're white? I'm sorry. I thought you were black. You have a good day, sir. Where was my white privilege? I never got off. These people harassed me all the time. Where is my white privilege? It's never got me out of any of my legal trouble. So like people say, oh well, blacks get a more harsh sentence in courtrooms than whites, and maybe there's some truth to that. But let me give you some explanation for why that may be. I know because I've seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of felony cases. I've been through it all. Going through this stuff, going through this mess because of these police officers. And what I seen firsthand is, I'm not saying this is right. I'm not taking up for the judges or the police officers, but this is what I see. Black people go in there sagging, shirts, t-shirt, and they're still speaking their ghetto slang, and they're not respecting the judge, and I don't blame them. That's what I want to do. But I don't dress normal when I go in the courtroom. I dress like a geek. I wear my button-up shirt, a tie. Not that you should, but hey, if it makes them look at me different and it's going to help my case, that's what I'm doing. Another thing is that there's an economic factor here. Obviously, if you have an attorney, then that makes a difference, and black people typically are less wealthy, on average. Not all the time, of course. It's just a general idea. It's just a statistic, okay? So they're less likely to have the money to pay for their own private attorney. That's going to change the sentencing. Also, the sentencing guidelines that they go by is largely based on priors. In the black communities, there's more crime. So blacks are also more likely to have priors. All these things go into account. Not saying that it's right, but it's reality. So in the same way that the police officers saw me and started harassing me, they're going to also harass black people who are riding around with rims, bumping rap music, because what's rap music talking about? It's just a stereotype. Doesn't make it okay, but that's what they're doing. Another thing that likely got me pulled over more than I should have been was the time of day, or better yet, the time of night I was driving. That's another way that police officers profile people. So, especially where I grew up, in a suburb, West Carrollton, outside of Dayton, Ohio, there's not a lot of people driving around at 2 a.m. And a high percentage of those people are drinking, they're partying, stuff like that. It's devil's hour, around that time. So they already know that. So they see a young kid in a car that's decked out with rims, music bumping, and it's midnight or 2 or 3 a.m. They're assuming that you're doing something illegal. And a lot of times they're right, but that doesn't give them the right to pull you over and harass you. And maybe some cops do pull people over because they're black. Maybe it does happen. I have heard of it happening, by the way that you look. But if you're white and you've got tattoos all over your face and you're all, whatever, they're going to pull you over because of the way you look also. So while the police may be a little bit more harsh on black people with the way that they stereotype them, it isn't like white people are privileged because they just let white people get away with anything, and they're just pulling over black people. And I can tell you from firsthand experience from all this stuff, I've been profiled like I couldn't believe, and I'm white. So the system needs to change. White people don't need to be feeling guilty. It's the system. We've got to focus. The reason why this topic is so important is because we have to focus we have to focus our energy on the real problem, which is the system. The war on drugs, the huge federal government that is ruling over us. That is the problem. It's not all white people. that is the problem. A lot of white people like black people. I have cousins, several cousins actually, that only date black men. So there's one thing right there. So I've even got friends that, white friends that talk black, that prefer to hang around with black people. You know what I mean? Like, there are a lot of white people that prefer black people for friends or lovers or whatever. So it also goes both ways. So yeah, you might have some white people that don't like blacks, but for every one of them, there's probably two that prefer blacks. You know, even me as a young kid, that's how I was. I usually always have black friends. Does it make it wrong or right? You know, I got criticized for liking black friends too much. It's just the way people are allowed to have their own preferences. You know, people, and there is a difference in people. Black people are different than white people. You know, you want everything to be fair. Things aren't fair. Look at the NBA. There's no you know, disproportionate amount of white people running the NBA. Look at the NBA players. If anything, it's the other way around. Blacks are a small portion of the population, but most of the NBA players are black. So if this is a racist culture, why do they have black? Why are they paying these black people so much money to play these sports? It isn't just basketball. Most of the sports are dominated by black people playing. Yeah, maybe white people that own it, but if rich white people hate black people, and it's systemic, as a lot of people claim, why don't the white people pay other white people millions of dollars to throw a ball around, throw it in the hoop? The truth is the racism problem isn't as big as what people think. And a lot of the problem that exists because of racism is due to our lack of education. It's due to us being forced to go to a school system that teaches us some sort of wrong history. I mean, it's really not the right history, because I had to learn this in my 30s. I had to learn this much later in life. I certainly didn't learn all this stuff in the classroom, which is why I'm teaching you what I've learned in this podcast today. Why do even black people always talk about wanting to make it out of the hood? Well, there's a lot of crime in the hood. Well, that's because there's poverty in the hood. And one of the big problems is correlated to single-parent households. And the reason why I bring this up is because this is something that we can actually change. We can't change a system, but we can be fathers. We can be parents. We can be better fathers, better parents. We can stick around. And that seems to be largely correlated to increased rates in crime, increased rates in poverty. And that's what's really hurting the black community more than the whites. Like even Tupac said, and they say it's the white man I should fear, but it's my own kind doing all the killing here. So blacks are far more likely to be shot and killed by another black person than they are a white person. The same goes true for white people. White people are much more likely to be killed by another white person than they are another black person. Why? Are the white people racist against themselves? Are the black people racist towards other black people? No, that's just the way life is. Numbers aren't even, right? There's reasons why these numbers are the way that they are. And that reason is simple. It's because black people usually live in black neighborhoods and therefore hang around other black people. So when they have a problem, they're going to have a problem with the black person, because that's who they associate with. And the same thing goes with white people. It's just the way that it is. Another misconception that people have when they hear statistics like, oh, well, you know, per 100,000 black people, you're 6 times as likely to get shot by a cop than 100,000 of white people. And that's true. That's true. But also when you look at the murders, black males specifically are 6 times as likely to commit a murder. And these are statistics. I'm not making this up. So it's like this, you know, when I worked in Best Buy as a 16-year-old, I got my car, I moved to, I could drive, so I picked my favorite place to work at, which was Best Buy. And I worked in the CD section where you had the CDs, video games, software, back when they sold CDs and VHS tapes. And so I would watch and I would try to help prevent theft. And one of the things that we would look for is in the rap aisle. Not because black people went there, but because that's the CDs that were getting stolen more often than anything else. I didn't just go look for it when there was a black person there, when there were white kids there, because white kids steal too. If black people disproportionately shop for rap music as opposed to country and rock and other stuff, you could do statistics to make it seem like, oh, well, you're watching black people more than white people. No. I'm watching the rap aisle, and black people are disproportionately going to the rap aisle compared to other musical genres. So it's not racist, it is what it is. It's kind of like the slavery. They weren't racist by making the black people slaves. It's just their skin happened to be black. Racist is when you are solely making judgments or actions based on the color of a person's skin. That's wrong. But if you arrest someone for shoplifting and they just happen to be black, that's not racist. So there's a difference here. But there's always a political agenda when they're pushing these kind of narratives on the people, because the government wants, or it's you have to create a problem so you get a reaction. It's the Hegelian dialect. Create a problem so that you get a reaction, so that way you can implement the solution which you already had in mind. But it's usually to get the people to accept a solution that they wouldn't accept otherwise if they didn't have this problem. So that's what this racism and white guilt and all these things are about. It's the government creating problems so that way they have work. It's kind of like you take your car to a mechanic and like the mechanics, they check the oil because they're doing an oil change, and they're like, hey, do you know you need some brakes? You need this, you need that. That's what they're doing. They're trying to help you identify a problem so that way they have a job to do. And that's all it is. And we need to remember that when the government, the media, is throwing these things at us. It's their desire for increased money, increased power, increased control over all of us.
Thanks for tuning in to the Awareness Revolution Podcast. Be the change you wish to see in the world.